In 1948, Aneurin Bevan, then the Minister of Health, established a national health service in Britain. Bevan said that the silent suffering of the old, the young, the chronically sick and the handicapped had no place in a civilised society. Last Christmas, a report by Professor Donald Court's Committee on Child Health Care was finally published, after the government had delayed its release for almost a year. The report said that due to the state of the health service, thousands of children who could be saved were dying. It said, and I quote, "Twice as many children of unskilled workers die in the first month of life as the children of professional workers, and the gap between the social classes in health care has been widening for 25 years. In that same week, at Northampton General Hospital, 50 senior doctors issued a public statement which said that people who could be cured were dying, and they were dying because their hospital was being refused funds. The doctor's statement, issued in desperation, was the first of its kind in Britain. It was also the first real evidence that the silent suffering to which Bevan referred had come back as a direct result of public spending cuts by this government. The examples that will follow are not the most sensational or the most shocking. They are typical, nor is this report merely about cutbacks. It's about a dismantling, a tearing down of whole sections of what was once Britain's most civilising post-war achievement, your health service.
I suspect very strongly that the service here will break down.
It's a very hard thing to tell people that they have to wait for a diagnostic procedure when you know very well that they may have cancer in the bladder.
Would you have your immediate family or friends put in such conditions, in such operating conditions?
Under no circumstances whatsoever. The answer is no.
In 1939, the year I was born, plans were made to close this building. And now I'm a consultant, and we're still using it with no hope of closure.
This Victorian workhouse was meant to be demolished in the year the doctor was born, and it was unfit to be a hospital then. It was built before Florence Nightingale was born. 2/3 of all mental hospitals in Britain were built before 1891. This one in Surrey, called Murray House, is a typical slum hospital preserved because of government cuts.
Throughout Murray House, for the 150 patients here, we have 50 nurses to cover the needs day and night. And to reach minimum safety levels, we should have 86. To reach something that is satisfactory for what we're trying to do, we should have 100.
Minimum safety levels are 86,
That's
and
right.
you've got 50.
Yes, that's right.
So without even enough staff of the minimum safety level, seriously handicapped people are confined in this bare room. They include a blind man and epileptics. There are no games and no toys here. They do nothing. They stare at nothing. Incredibly, this is called the activities room.
A few of our patients, through years of boredom and inactivity, find ways of stimulating themselves. And this could well be by hitting themselves or pushing their fingers down their throat and making themselves sick.
Due to government plans to save money, there is no one with the time to teach them regularly. Their boredom becomes a frenzy. Some have great potential, but here they are reduced to human litter.
You take this lad, for example, as you can see, he's severely physically handicapped. We have a wheelchair designed to meet his needs so that he can now be mobile. But what would have been so important for this lad would have been physiotherapy.
Is he getting any physiotherapy at all now?
I would imagine probably none, because we are extremely short of physiotherapists. For all the patients in this hospital, that is 150, we have the services of one physiotherapist for 1/2 day a week. And not only does she care for the patients, but she looks after the wheelchairs and all the appliances we have in this hospital and in Berkeley's Park.
She has to do a maintenance job as well, does she?
She does indeed.
As well as being a therapist.
That's right, yes.
Thousands of desperately needed nurses won't find jobs this year because of government policies that scrap the investment of their training and stop their careers. Yet the government's priorities document on health says that what money is available should be concentrated on these people. This is how it is being concentrated at Murray House, where the nurses have no time for real care. As a direct result of these economies, the patients become more dependent and more handicapped. Where's it gone wrong as far as the Murray houses of the country are concerned?
Not enough money has been spent.
He's right.
He is right indeed, isn't he? Yes.
Not
What
enough
did you
staff.
say? Not enough staff. That's quite right. Yes.
The situation is so desperate here that this severely handicapped man seized upon the presence of our camera to cry out for more staff. There is seldom anyone with the time to push him into the sunlight. And this is where they sleep, all 35 of them. They have no personal cupboards, nowhere to put even a few snapshots, and the only trace of personal identity is this, a name tag at the end of a bed. Even the splashes of colour, the only splashes of colour, are bedspreads which they paid for out of their own pocket. We couldn't afford them. Every day they are blasted with pop music coming through a tinny, wheezing speaker. That's what they call therapy. There's no other therapy, no speech therapy, very little physiotherapy. We can't afford it. There have been several changes since I was last here. They've taken down the old workhouse plaque, and yesterday, just for our benefit, they painted this rotting wall. This morning a nurse told me there were no toys here for the kids in the hospital, and the only toy we've been able to find in this ward is this. But the monuments to their final degradation is in here. The government can't afford to put partitions between these lavatories. And for 2 years, the patients were forced to sit on the cold porcelain through winters because we couldn't afford the lavatory seats. Their one possession is this, a toothbrush. The government spends 4% of the National Health Service budget on the mentally handicapped. Just 4%, and we're cutting back. And as they cut back, they rely more and more on heavy dosages of drugs as a substitute for staff. Last year, the Health Service spent almost £500 million on drugs. Last April, the drug companies did a deal with the Department of Health. They agreed to stabilise their competition so long as they could maintain their profits. Mind-controlling drugs are potentially dangerous and need constant research and expert supervision, both of which have been cut back. And yet the use of cocktails of these drugs is becoming widespread to treat patients or to keep them quiet and stupefied. A director of the Association of Pharmaceutical Industries says that 100,000 mental patients should be controlled by drugs. For us, this is a tremendous growth area. Social Services Secretary David Ennals says, "I don't believe that most patients want a full breakfast. It leads to waste." Taking Mr. Ennals' lead, nutritional foods like milk and butter are being cut back. At West Cheshire Mental Hospital, there isn't enough milk for the morning cereals, and the cook has to get 10 meals out of a 2.5-pound chicken. Under Mr. Ennals' scheme of cash limits, every patient, no matter how helpless, is now considered cost-effective.
Society wants every aspect of its functioning to be cost-effective. What are we getting in the end when we have spent this amount of money is the question that has to be asked in politics, in industry, in every aspect of our living. And the answer in mental handicap is very difficult to find.
How can you look at Charlie and say, how cost-effective is Charlie?
I don't ask that question. Society asks that question. Society will say, if we provide a hospital bed for Charlie costing £100 a week, what will we get at the end?
How often is the word society used to deny direct political responsibility? Cost-effective Charlie is denied proper care, therapy, even the joy of regular outings because of political decisions. Decisions which mean that the modest needs of people like Charlie can never be met. Decisions that can only satisfy the ever-changing demands of politicians and the Treasury. At Rainhill Mental Hospital near Liverpool, wards are locked which by law should be open. And in the opinion of nurses, individual drug regimes show that patients are being deliberately over-sedated. And this is cost-effectiveness. At Rainhill Hospital, this floor was left covered with feces, shit, because there were no cleaners. Finally, the overworked nurses had to scrape it off. A nurse at Rainhill said, "I defy you to show me one patient, and we've got 1,600, who is regularly receiving psychotherapy." The suffering which the mentally ill and handicapped have quietly endured for years is now coming home to you, who use ordinary hospitals. This is Hackney Hospital, London, described by its 45 junior doctors as a public showplace of how squalid the health service can be. Hackney Hospital farms out expectant mothers to an old Salvation Army place called the Mothers' Hospital, where there is no resuscitation team and no anaesthetist. When a mother and baby are in potential danger, the anaesthetist, a doctor, has to wait for a minicab, then drive through often heavy traffic from the main hospital. The district administrator calls this place very unsatisfactory, but at the same time he objects to publicity because he says Hackney mothers will be frightened to have their babies there. The infant mortality rate for Hackney is 25% above the national average.
Well, what happens when a woman is actually having a child, an emergency, and you're stuck up here trying to get a taxi, and they're down there having their child, and no one knows the drugs and so on? What happens then?
They have to, whatever have to happen will happen, that's all. You can't do anything. You try to reach as early as you can, that's all.
It almost leaves me speechless.
Sorry?
I said it almost leaves me speechless.
Yes.
When you say that there's really nothing you can do about it. If a woman's having...
I can't do.
No, I know. I can see that.
And there is no one is going to blame me. I'm ready to come, but there is nothing for
You're
me.
waiting for your taxi up here, and a woman's having a baby down there.
Now, this, in my opinion, is an extremely dangerous position. It puts us in a very... It puts the mother and the baby in an extremely dangerous position, which might very well lead to fetal death.
There was one stillbirth. I don't know, it's because of my delay or what happened. It happened with me. If I could have reached there about maybe a half an hour earlier, things would have maybe changed. Baby wouldn't have died. I wouldn't know.
But you don't, and I suppose anybody will ever know, will they?
No. You have to accept it.
We were called over to a Caesar last week, and there were no tubes, no endotracheal tubes. Of course, you can't possibly anaesthetize without.
What happened?
Well, we had to use an unsuitable tube, which was dangerous. I've anaesthetized under all sorts of conditions in all sorts of places, and I've never felt unhappy. I've never felt that I might lose a patient, ever, except at the mother's, and I feel unhappy there.
What worries you most?
Well, that we shall have a disaster there. I think that's what worries me most. An anaesthetic disaster, of course. I'm not responsible for any other sort of disaster.
Would you have your immediate family or friends put in such conditions, in such operating
Under no
conditions?
circumstances whatsoever. The answer is no.
But many of these outpatients at Hackney Hospital have no choice but to put their family and friends in these conditions.
We've got people on our waiting lists particularly for total joint replacement, in whom the need is, in some cases, definitely urgent because they're in constant pain, virtually unable to move, even with crutches. Sometimes they can't even hold the crutches because their hands are crippled as well, and who are now at the limit of what can be done to control pain with all the tablets on the list.
Most of the patients that are suitable for total hip replacement are old people whose lifespan is not very extensive. They may have several years to live, and a year is probably a long time to be in a lot of pain. They're suffering and will be suffering for longer periods of time now, because we won't be able to get them in anywhere like the time we've been able to up till recently. Because instead of improving facilities here, the situation is getting worse.
It has already worsened nationally. The Arthritis and Rheumatism Council reports that urgent cases of all people needing hip and knee replacement have to wait up to 3 years.
Today we had 5 people due for their annual review operation.
What's that?
Well, these are people suffering from cancer of the bladder, and they require an examination of the bladder under general anaesthesia. And unfortunately, they all had to go home. We're operating tomorrow morning, and we've told them to come back in the morning in the hope that we may have some discharges from the male surgical wards in the morning.
The effect on them must be quite traumatic, really, to build up to coming to hospital.
I think it would be very upsetting. I was operating myself today, so unfortunately, if you like, I didn't have to face them and tell them.
In 1973, the Hospital Advisory Service described the psychiatric wards at Hackney as some of the worst wards for the care of the mentally ill they'd ever seen. 4 years later, Dr. John Reed, psychiatrist at Hackney, went to the press only after sewage came pouring down the wards for the 3rd time. Health Minister Roland Moyle came to see the wards, but that turned out to be little more than a public relations exercise. The wards are still chronically overcrowded.
There were 2 people who should have been in hospital and who did commit suicide out in the community. One was a problem that is not unique to this hospital. This is the problem of someone who needs secure accommodation, who is a risk to security. The other person was more directly a result of the shortage of beds, that we were trying to get him into hospital, and while we were negotiating a bed, he left the casualty department and later committed suicide. We would have liked him to come into hospital, but it took us too long to find a bed.
When the late Anthony Crossland made a speech about the government's plans to cut public spending, he said, "The party's over. For people who live in places like Hackney, the party never began. Hackney has more tuberculosis, more bronchitis, more lung cancer, more accidents, more battered kids than almost anywhere else." The people of Hackney, many of whom live on rat-infested estates and whose children have to play in dangerous playgrounds, depend on their hospital as a front line against greater hardship, but no more. Tell me what happened when the ambulance came and picked him up.
Well, I said to the ambulance man, take him to the children's hospital. So he says, "Oh, the question, we can't." And they wouldn't take him, they turned him away. So he said, "The nearest one we can take him is St. Leonard's."
Hackney turned him away?
Pardon?
Hackney turned the other patient?
No, we didn't try the Hackney.
But
they turned away somebody else before us.
Since the closure of the children's wards here, it's made it difficult to deal with paediatric cases. Of course, the children that have ingested corrosives or been involved in serious road traffic accidents, we give them preliminary care here, but as we have no ward facilities, we have to transfer them. And I think this leads to a lot of hardship, particularly if families are involved in a road traffic accident and they have to be separated.
I suspect very strongly that the service here will break down, that in the sense that we will find ourselves in a situation where there are people who must come in when there are no beds and no way of finding beds for them to come in. It's always more difficult in the winter months. And we were within an ace of this. In fact, we did close on many occasions last winter.
In January, all 45 junior doctors gave Health Minister Moyle a statement which said, "We have argued our case to the district, area and region authorities and to the press, but nothing has been done, and we are now a public showplace of how squalid the health service can be." So what are the government doing about it all? David Ennals claims that his Resource Allocation Working Party, known as RAWP, is reallocating funds to so-called underprivileged areas, as if healthcare is a privilege. This is underprivileged Oldham, a typical area where the need for healthcare is greatest. And yet Oldham, with even £300,000 extra this year, will barely have enough to maintain its present calamities.
The problem that we have here is that we haven't got enough diagnostic facilities. It takes far too long to get a diagnosis. For instance, a patient who had a bladder cancer, the only symptom he may have is some bleeding in his water, and he presents with that. Now, it's not always, of course, a bladder tumour that does that, but sometimes it is.
Well, how long do you have to wait before you know that he's got it, before you can diagnose it?
Well, at the moment, it's taking something like 4 months to get the diagnosis in these hospitals, and this is because we haven't got the facilities to do it quicker than that. The main thing that's holding it up is the X-ray department, the facilities in the X-ray department. There's not enough room nor enough equipment down there to do them quickly. Even if we had the money to put the equipment in, there isn't the room to do it. I mean, it just isn't there.
Well, when they finally have their X-ray and it's confirmed that they have, say, something like a cancer, then what usually happens? How long does it take before they're on the operating table?
Well, when I suspect that they've got a cancer, at the moment, I can get them in usually within 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes a bit longer, but certainly a month would be an outside time.
So we've gone to, what, well over 4 months.
Yes.
In that time, taking, a cancer, say, like a bladder cancer,
yes,
it would have proceeded, would it not?
Yes, certainly. There's been quite a lot of work in the past on this, delay in diagnosis in bladder cancer, and there's no doubt that any delay is dangerous. This is why they should be dealt with straight away, and patients shouldn't wait. Not only have they got symptoms, but they run into the problems of complications and even risking death in many instances if they wait. One must remember this. It's very often just as much a strain on the doctor, because we're worried about our patients, we're concerned about them, and it's a very hard thing to tell people that they have to wait for a diagnostic procedure when you know very well that they may have a cancer in their bladder.
You would not have seen this report if a number of people whom you employ in the health service bureaucracy had had their way. Since last June, certain health officials have coordinated their efforts to prevent us filming, to obstruct our filming, and to stop tonight's transmission. For example, at Rainhill Hospital near Liverpool, our film crew was barred over the objections of people who worked there, who wanted you to see the scandalous conditions of the hospital. At Hackney Hospital, unrelenting pressure has been applied to doctors, and especially to one consultant, a sick man, to withdraw from the film. Also at Hackney, the hospital secretary has demanded that a doctor sign a statement she did not write, disclaiming an interview about the dangers to mothers and babies at Hackney. All this amounts to a cover-up of the damage being done to your health service by expedient and unplanned cuts. Make no mistake, the people who actually care for the sick, the doctors, nurses, and ancillary staff, are among the most efficient and productive workers in the country. But while the beehive of administrators and deputy administrators and assistant administrators and their public relations protectors has doubled in the last 12 years, it is the doctors and nurses and their vital support people who are being cut back. And it is the doctors and nurses' modest demands for life-saving equipment, for beds, and for basic standards of hygiene that are being denied. Britain has economic problems, says David Ennals, so there must be priorities, and some people must be hurt. But who must be hurt, Mr. Ennals? Not the people with access to fine teaching hospitals, not the people with cars and phones, not the people who know how to make a fuss. Those who must be hurt are the people without privilege, the helpless people in slum mental hospitals, like cost-effective Charlie, and the people like the man who committed suicide after there were no beds available at the impoverished psychiatric ward at Hackney, described as a rat pit. Let me quote from the statement issued by the 50 senior doctors at Northampton Hospital. Due to the cutbacks, they said, Seriously ill patients will have to wait until their plight becomes an emergency. There will be some patients, in all age groups, who will die. We are not merely predicting what will happen, for it is already happening.